Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support, rockfin.com/aroundtheempire or patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And please like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel. Michael Vlahos joins us today, and we discuss his article published at the American Conservative titled "The Doom of the Elite. The rise and fall of elites shapes our history and can be predicted." In a bonus episode, we talk about the prospects for a new civil war, Vlahos' theory that cancel culture is a response to the decline, and other warnings from his recent article titled "There Will Be Blood, Beware the Ides of March." Michael Vlahos is an author, a military historian, and a strategist. He has taught war and strategy graduate courses at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the U.S. Naval War College, and at Centro Estudios Superiores Navales. He's also the author of a book, Fighting Identity, Sacred War and World Change, and he's a weekly contributor to the John Batchelor Show. We recorded this on April 15th, 2021. Michael Vlahos is here with us today. Thank you so much. He's talking to us from the Washington, D.C. area. Thank you for joining the show today. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Absolutely.
Since it's the first time on this podcast, would you mind just taking a few minutes to tell everybody about yourself?
Well, I'm essentially a student and a teacher of war and strategy, and I have been since, for over 60 years, and I've been teaching since 1980 in that field, in the graduate arena, and I've taught at the School for Advanced International Studies, where I was director of security studies in the 80s, taught more recently at Johns Hopkins AAP and the Zanville Krieger School. For a number of years, I was a professor at the Naval War College. I've also served in the State Department, CIA, Navy, and I've also taught at the headquarters of the Mexican Navy at the Centro Estudios Superiores Navales. And that was one of the most rewarding teaching experiences I've had. So I've been around, and I've had a chance to spend a lot of time with field grade officers as their professor, and that's given me a strong window into the world of the American Empire.
Yeah, I'm way out of my league here. I mean, you realize that, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this article that you wrote. And also, I'm a listener of some segments of the John Batchelor Show and that began when I started listening to Stephen Cohen's weekly interviews with him on Ukraine and Russia, and then Russiagate and so on. And so you've also done a series on a new civil war, and you have compared the Roman Empire, the decline of the the entirety of the Roman Empire, to our situation today, which I find very interesting. So, hopefully some of that will be woven into what we talk about. And I urge people to I'll link some of those segments in the show notes. And, I urge people to hop in on that, go back and listen to some of the old ones. And there's a lot of insight in there. But this article really, really caught fire. I think not just with me. It seems like it got a lot of attention. The title is "The Doom of the Elite in the American Conservative," which I read a lot, even though I'm technically not a conservative. I hold some conservative positions, and I find a lot of common ground with some conservatives on war and foreign policy, I think, as does a lot of the audience of this podcast. So let me just read the opening paragraph here, and then we can do a little bit more high-level background just to sort of give people some reference points. But Professor Vlahos says, civilization is taught as the history of the elites. For 5,000 years, the world of cities has depended on elites for leadership. Yet leadership gone bad is the oldest story of civilization. Leadership becomes aristocracy. The authority to govern becomes the right to rule. Law giving becomes law enforcement. Duty to defend becomes a license to oppress. I'm tempted to go further, but I'll leave it there. And if you would, and as I said in my email to you, I know this is a hilarious question, but can we do some just high level, very high level background to give people some reference points on the Roman Empire that you're considering in your analysis and comparative analysis?
Well, to start, as they say from the beginning, it needs to be understood that what we call civilization or know of as civilization is really the world of cities. So civilization goes back, 10,000 years ago, roughly. And a world of cities, ipso facto, means a world of elites, that a leadership class of some kind not only has to emerge, but has to be solidified and institutionalized to lead the community. And as a result, you have really history as a history of elites. And the question is, what is the relationship between elites and the people, the community as a whole?
Yeah.
And if that relationship is good, if it's considered equitable at some level in the sense that there is input from both sides, and that there is a good, fair distribution of wealth, and that there is a constitutional order, delivery of justice that people buy into. And in many ways, most important, if when the community needs to defend itself, there is a good relationship between elite leadership and the people as they go out to do battle in defense of their community, their city. And we look through history and see that that relationship over time tends to change, just as the community itself changes. It grows, it can expand, it can encompass other communities, and then eventually you have what emerges as a kind of imperial structure. And in any kind of larger or more elaborate elite community, you get an inflow of wealth, and it's at that point that elites tend to arrogate the wealth to themselves, and you begin to see an increasing separation of elites and people. Also, a very successful city-state, if you will, or republic, as it gets more powerful, begins to focus increasingly on status and hierarchy that tend to separate the elites from the people. And elites become increasingly consumed with the search for status and an increasingly elaborate hierarchy that can segment one's position within the elite and within the community. And eventually, elites become poor leaders in the sense that they come to think too much of themselves and too little, or they take too little of the people themselves, or they take the people increasingly for granted. And a highly successful state will tend to assume that the loyalty of the people, both in terms of supporting the elite, but also serving as soldiers to help defend that city, that state, will always be there, because they are, after all, benefiting from the success of the state, and they are sharing in the glory of this larger enterprise. And that is where elites go wrong. And what I've discovered in many ways from my long old friendship with Neil Howe, who's well known for his book on generations and the fourth turning, has a sense of a cycle of elites over several generations. I think for him it's 4, but taking that metaphor as a kind of a notional template, I sort of superimposed it on segments of history and found that, in fact, you do have what amounts to a rise and fall of elites. And once a system or a state reaches a point of peak success, you also have the beginning of the unraveling of the elite, the beginning of corruption, of self-absorption, and of increasing distance, and eventually even contempt for the people. And this is shown in many sort of episodic periods in history. I mean, you see it, for example, in the period from the rise of France under Louis XIV to the French Revolution. You see it several times in the United States, where elites get out of hand. The first elite to get out of hand was the planter aristocracy in the young America in the 19th century up through the Civil War. Then you had what we all remember as a kind of robber baron elite that also rose and fell fairly quickly, over a period of about 70 years. So did the Southern planter class. And then you had the emergence after FDR of a kind of liberal democratic elite that had some socialist coloration around the edges, but was more of a technocratic and state-oriented vision of American life. And that began around 1930, and it's, I believe, unraveling today. It's reached a point, its peak success was clearly in World War II, and it's now in, if you will, if you think of like the Marianas Trench, it's approaching peak corruption, and I think is in deep trouble, and either not aware of that or in strenuous denial, and forces are moving to upheaval. And that's one of the dynamics that I think is behind the apparent division in American life, which is in front of us, every day, and is not caused by a single person like Mr. Trump, nor is it caused by some wayward group of benighted, left behind Americans, AKA the deplorables, and nor is it a function of racism, whatever racism might be, always a useful confection for driving a power grab, but is in fact caused by this deeper disaffection and coming apart of the relationship between America and its elites. And I try and go through some of the elements of that and some of the kinds of ways in which the relationship takes a wrong turn. I mean, it certainly did for Rome, and in many ways, one of the most evocative stories, one of the narratives that's been enshrined in Western modernity, in a world after the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, in which Greek and Latin were de rigueur for any elite individual. And so you had a powerful emphasis in elite education on the narrative of Rome and the fall of the Republic. And certainly that does seem to fit, at least in the sense that Americans seem entranced by this story of the decline and fall of the Republic, the emergence of an empire, which of course would lead eventually to the so-called fall of Rome. And that's presented as a kind of a cautionary moral tale. But in fact, it does seem to fit. If one was to look at the Roman Republic from the beginning of the first century, and say around 110 to 90 BC, and extended all the way to Augustus, you have a series of generations that tend to, as elites, tend to drive the Republic into self-destruction, and no one can stop it. Everyone sees it, but no one can stop it. And in effect, what brought me to this kind of recognition, insofar as our society is concerned, is the fact that everyone sees it, but no one can face up to it for what it is. No one can face up to their own contribution, responsibility, culpability for the fact that it is proceeding toward a grand crisis, a grand confrontation, just as it did in the late Roman Republic. And the outcome, in effect, even from this distance, knowing that it's still in the future, the outcome so far looks to be right on track with Rome. And so, if I were to go and talk about what the components of this elite decay might be, the first would be that elites always seek to grow their status and wealth. This was an understanding that was, as far as I'm concerned, substantiated in the data by Thomas Piketty, the French economist, and he wrote a book, Capital, which basically shows, by using all of the data collected by governments and their tax systems, that after the 18th century up till today, you can see that inherited wealth, properly invested, will always yield more return than inflation. And what that means is that, by definition, the wealthy are going to get wealthier, and they're going to, by passing it on to their children, they're going to create a trajectory for them as a class that will end up making them richer, and the regular people are going to fall behind. And it's in fact what's happened. I mean, after the period of World War II, and you have to remember the Great Depression and World War II were great events for the American people because they destroyed wealth. The Great Depression wiped out billions and billions of dollars at a time when the American GDP was something like 90 billion a year. I mean, several times that was wiped out. And then the World War II forced a kind of greater income equality. And by the time you get to the post-war era, you have a inequality ratio in which the top decile, the top 10% in the country, have about 35% of the wealth. Well, guess what it is today? It's way over 50%. It's as bad as it's ever been in American life, in the American experience. So essentially, you have an unsustainable trajectory of elite power. And that leads to the second part, which is that, elites become disconnected from the people they once led. And whether or not we want to admit it, it essentially can't be denied that American success as a nation is built on the relationship between elites and people in war. The three great wars, each 80 years apart, which is interesting, each part of the cycle, created the great nation that we have been for the last 80 years, dominating the world. And it was done by collective effort, privation and sacrifice in war. So that was certainly true of the relationship between, say, George Washington and the Continental Army and all the militias that fought as well. It was certainly true of both sides in the Civil War and their relationship to a kind of ultimately mystical leader, whether it was Abraham Lincoln or Robert E. Lee. And in World War II, there were several such leaders on the field, one of whom became president, Dwight Eisenhower. But there was also this figure of FDR, who was an extraordinarily compelling leader, in part because of his own wounded
elite background, yeah.
And the fact is that he presented a compelling figure to Americans that they could relate to. And there's a lot going on there we don't have to go into. But then that was re-evoked to some extent by Reagan, but only partly so. And the fact is that the shared sense of sacrifice, which in the past has taken the form of a great war, is now out of reach. It can't be reawakened, because we can't have another great war that becomes a glorious, transformative national experience and that has the incredibly unacknowledged but also unanticipated consequences of reorganizing the distribution of wealth in the country. So these are all things that have happened, and they go further when elites come to believe that they are the nation. And that is definitely where we are today. Elites define the entirety of the national lifestyle around them as yuppie figures, as woke, as all of entertainment and the entirety of how we should define our worldview, the entirety of virtue. All of that is defined by a tiny slice of American life, and then essentially is in the process of being forced upon an America, the majority of whose citizens oppose this vision. They don't find it acceptable. And so there is a deep divide just in that. And to make things worse, elites tend to push solutions, like pushing the world of woke that, I call in one of my recent articles, the Church of Woke, is a kind of forced conversion, which is really an assertion of power. And it is one thing, and a very bad thing, to have such an intense, skewed distribution of wealth and income. But it's even worse, much worse, to have elites despising, to have contempt for their own people, and to then go as far as to try and force them to accept a way of life that they recoil from, or only accept because they're essentially dependents. I mean, we all know that Hispanics and African Americans are essentially support a conservative vision of life, especially true of Hispanics. And that's, I think, at the heart of why so many switched and voted for Mr. Trump in the recent election. You have a majority of Americans who resist the initiatives, the overall vision of the ruling class, and the ruling class cannot accept this resistance and seeks to break it or bring people to a kind of political religious submission. And I think that is, going on the path toward fall.
Yeah, I'm not, it doesn't matter so much whether I agree or not. I'm here to hear your thoughts on it. I just don't see it as much as a partisan thing as maybe you do, although the definition of liberal might be the issue there. I think there's an establishment right that is completely in line with the establishment left. And to me, that's my view of the elites and the ruling elites, if you will.
Right.
But I know the definition of liberal is very different among some people. more classical liberal, then we are talking about that whole stratum of what I would call the establishment right and left. But that's neither here nor there.
Well, it is sort of. If I could clarify,
Sure, yeah, sure.
There is a red elite, obviously, and it's been much stronger in the past, but it's waned in the last several years. And it's very much smaller than the blue elite, and the blue elite dominates now the corporate world as well as media and academia and much of our institutional fabric. And there's also been a shift in terms of the younger age cohorts where you're seeing less of that red elite emerging in the younger generations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And as a result, it's been shrinking, whereas the sense of an uprooted and dispossessed working class moving toward red has also been a powerful movement. And if you look at the counties that voted blue in the last election, they encompass 71% of America's GDP. And a lot of people voted blue, and they voted blue for reasons that aren't necessarily out of enthusiasm for this political religious vision, but in large part were out of residual loyalty or out of the fact that they have much to gain from a blue administration. And I don't think ultimately it's partisan in the sense that this divide flows from a political party as its source. It flows from the more basic elite versus people problem that I've been trying to outline. And the elite has kind of lost its balance, and the elite is increasingly separate from the body of American people. And that is a deeper problem. And of course, it sort of then takes the form of red versus blue, but I totally agree. It's not a red versus blue issue.
Yeah, it's just we have to use those categories to as shortcuts for what we're trying to say. If we had to describe what red and blue is anymore, what any of these labels, they're having a hard time fitting anyone. I can't find a box that I fit in, for example. But the causes that they claim to champion, those are pretty red and blue. And the exploitation of certain demographics, I mean, is without a doubt. I mean, this is very clear. But do they really represent the interests of those demographics? As a woman, I know that that's not true. The people who say that they are, I mean, in some ways they do, but in general and in the long run, no, I don't think that they really have my interests at heart. I think they intend to exploit my category because, yes. Yeah. So I think there's much of that going on, and it ties in with the need. Same with celebrities. Because the divide is so great, there's a chasm between the elite and the populace. They have to pretend that their interests are ours, and they have to commandeer celebrities, very popular people, and get them to try to advance their agenda. And really just to try to, I know this is a very simplified explanation, but, just to try to, whatever the word is to try to draw some of that popularity to themselves in alliance with celebrities. And that has really exploded over the last, I would say 10 years, but way more over just the last few years. It's accelerating at more than a linear pace. I don't know if it's exponential or whatever, but
celebrities are easy prey because they suffer from what sociologists term status inconsistency. They have this enormous adulation and following, and are treated like royalty, and yet they're just regular people. I used to be an actor in New York, and I have to say it's a wrenching experience to go through the meteoric or comet-like ascension from just being someone knocking on, trying to get an agent and get cast in something, to being something like a god, a demigod in the firmament of Hollywood. And so elites are easy prey because they have this deep insecurity. And across the board, I think elites are guilty, feel not shame, but I feel guilt because they are doing so well.
Like imposter syndrome a little bit.
Well, yeah, they need to find some dispensation, some, Deus ex machina, where, the Almighty reaches down and says, no, you're not to blame for any of this. You are, in fact, the elect. You are the ones who are leading the country to the promised land. And the way in which this has worked is through, you could call it elegant, but it's so obvious and brutal in the way it's being deployed that elegance doesn't seem to fit. And that is taking the traditional vision of the Marxists, which is to focus on class conflict and on a small elite that is oppressing the worker. Instead, it's a different kind of external force in terms of critical theory, critical race theory, intersectional ideology, and thus to transpose, to shift the entire nature of what, say, ails society away from this elite trajectory that is causing strain in the society and leaving people behind, the majority behind, instead to say, well, there is some force, racism, et cetera, that is the real cause of the nation's ills. And there is some malign group that is responsible. We know what that group is. And therefore, to embrace this is to become a kind of, it's the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, really, the idea that, you have been chosen, and therefore you are more motivated and driven to show your virtue, to express the fact that you are elect, that you are predestined, and to be the leader of this great transformation, of this great eventual salvational mission. And as a result, you have two things are achieved. First of all, the incipient guilt of the elite, who are, for the most part, liberal, but include people who are, traditional red type elites, like the Never Trumpers, for example. But they feel better, and they feel that they're in the right, that the cause is right and just. Deus vult, God wills it kind of thing. But also, and this is the big dividend, is by creating this giant strategic misdirection, you divide the people. So you've got people who are oppressed and suffering, and then you've got the deplorables who are somehow responsible for everything, but they're also oppressed and suffering and left behind. And you've essentially divided them. And in that way, elites are in a perfect position to maintain their power, even if the sweep or compass of their appeal only extends to maybe 50%, not all of whom are enthusiastic, but that's the most. And we see this in the outcome in 2020. And then you have a divided country that can be tweaked to favor one side or the other. And what blue seeks to do now is to tweak things so that the political process favors them. And in a way, elites have done this through history in order to find ways to maintain their dominance. I mean, this was one of the features toward the end of the Roman Republic. And that's why you, for example, had Caesar as one of the top elite types, an optimate, why you saw him championing the people against other elite types who could be demonized, Brutus, Cassius, the whole crew. And so he championed all of these measures that would help the poor, the populares. And ultimately, they were followed through and fulfilled by Augustus. But then what happened to the populares? They became dependent on social welfare, on the annona. And the annona provided basic income. That's what it was. You got bread, wine, a number of things, actually. And that put the former citizenry of Rome at the mercy and turned them into dependents on the new imperial system that emerged. So, I mean, this is a well-traveled road, shall we say.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. The right to lead, the chosen ones, that kind of thing, is a really tough issue right now, it seems. And right. I think that's why you could say my cause has been hijacked by people who pretend to be that is their higher cause. There are structural issues that had to, but they weren't insurmountable, right? So I went to engineering school, just give you just little bits, and women had only been allowed in that school, admitted to that school in the past decade, right?
Yeah. It
wasn't that women weren't allowed to go to college. It was Rutgers, so it was a very I hate to use the word liberal, but a very people-friendly university as far as they go from the start. But women didn't go to school for engineering. It was still like a 10-to-1 ratio when I went.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay, so I think that there were structural hurdles. They were not only institutional, they were fathers. There were fathers saying, middle-class fathers, I can't afford to send you to go to college if you're then just going to get married and not use that degree. We've got others in the family who, it was because of the cultural, structural issues. Right. So it wasn't, you know what I mean? It wasn't just the institution. It was a mix of things. And I'm sure that other people can put this into words much better than I can. I can only tell you what I experienced. But then as a young female engineer, it was very uncomfortable at times, particularly in factories. When people looked at me like I was some creature from outer space, like what the heck is she doing here? Or that it was confusing. It was a transition period. All through that, though, I understood that this was I wasn't one of the pioneers. I would say the generation ahead of me, or a half a generation ahead of me, were the real pioneers. Right. But, you had people like my mother who was dependent on others and wanted her daughters to have another option. Not that she was particularly unhappy, but she wanted us to have some form of supporting ourselves too, so that we weren't just complete dependents. So this transition, and this happened all through my career, always male executives, almost always white male executives, but it did change. And so some of these causes that were championed, but I would say by the people who really experienced them, I don't need someone to come along and like hijack my cause, because
Right.
really it's about money and power. It's always about money and power. And you're just masking that with my cause. I can't speak for other people, other demographics, and but there definitely were hurdles to overcome in the system, and there definitely were people along the way who felt threatened by that. So I mean, there was a oppression of sorts. You were held down. You did have to uh, work twice as hard or get lucky, or other ways that people advance themselves. So that kind of thing definitely is real. It's just that the causes that have been taken up by certain people, um, they don't work anymore. Well, you look at, I always use Nancy Pelosi as a, and I hate to get into the nitty gritty
Well,
politics, but I just am so frustrated by her. And I was a lifelong Democrat. I am no longer. Um, but I came back to the party before. I mean, I guess if it really became a genuine thing, it's possible that I could go back. But what I have seen in the past 10 years, longer probably, is this pressure for populism rising. People
right.
trying to say, hey, look, no, this is not working for us. You're not working in our interests.
Right.
The leaders don't ride on horses in the field with their troops anymore. So there's that segment of society too. And right now, all of the energy seems to be focused on suppressing that. And in anticipation of this uh, interview, because I am not a student of history, and I knew I was going to be way out of my league with the Roman Empire, I went to some of the documentaries from the BBC, which were okay. As the series went on, I liked them less and less. But there was one on Tiberius that was pretty good.
Yeah.
The one on Caesar, I guess, was pretty good. But the whole Tiberius issue, the way it was portrayed, at least in that documentary, as an historian, I can't really say whether it was accurate or not. But that's what was happening. Is there something going on here in our time that has a parallel to that age? And was Tiberius really representing? Was he really a populist, or am I misinterpreting that whole thing?
Well, as I was saying, toward the latter days of the Republic, you had the big men emerge because of all of Rome's foreign wars, and the wars had the collateral consequence of impoverishing all the soldiers because they were away from their farms, but they had to serve. And so they were all desperate and dependent on the big men who were optimates, who were aristocrats like Caesar. And then, of course, you have the super successful generals like Pompey. You have the unbelievable Bill Gates, rich Crassus, for example. And the result was this increasing dependency of the people on these big men. But the big men were part of this aristocratic class. And it just worked out in the way I described, so that by the time you get to Augustus and then after that Tiberius, you have a system in which the champions of the people against the upper class, which you'd seen in some parts of the Roman Civil War, had been replaced with a kind of hand-in-glove comedy where you had the emperor as an institution working hand-in-glove with the Senate, which was getting richer and richer and richer, and the people pacified by being on social welfare, on getting a basic income. And this was the Rome that people have hailed as being stable. And it was stable as long as nothing rocked the boat. But then, of course, it did eventually with plague and invasions and all the rest. But the problem today, for example, is if you look at the American elite, which is predominantly blue, and that, as I was trying to say earlier, is somewhat incidental. The policies of the elite that promise to raise up those who have been oppressed or who are hurting is a kind of a smokescreen, because the actual policies that are articulated in various legislative programs, like the climate New Deal, the Green New Deal, or in tax policy, really disproportionately and rather incredibly support the blue elite. It takes money and funnels it their way. And part of the movement against fossil fuels is something that will damage directly the residual red elite, who are heavy into things like, petro energy.
Yeah.
And this goes across the board. I mean, for example, allowing rich yuppies to deduct their state taxes is a tremendous assistance to them. It's there was a lot of criticism. I wouldn't call it criticism, just blatant attacks on the last president's so-called tax cut. Well, this is the same thing. It's just under new guise, and it effectively. Well, another example is free college, which would, or canceling student debt, that would disproportionately assist the well-off. And so you have an entire approach that has, like the Roman god Janus, two faces. And the overall result of their policies will be to continue to favor them. And this is something that the left behinds and deplorables see directly. I mean, they're literally hundreds of thousands of petro jobs lost by the decisions made in the last 100 days. And this is something people can see and feel. And it is there are all sorts of things. There's the bringing in low-skilled, low-wage workers into the U.S. In the form of open borders is also understood by so many millions in the country, including Hispanics, that that creates enormous resentment against the elites. I was talking yesterday to a guy I know who's from El Salvador, and he is undocumented, or illegal, if you want to use that term. And he's complaining about how the immigrants coming across the border are immediately given papers and a pathway to being legal. And he doesn't know if he'll ever get that because he came in the old-fashioned way, I mean, a couple decades ago. And it's interesting how the sensibilities of the people, no matter what their background is, has a deep connection. And so I'm finding myself, I'm not by any stretch in the blue camp, and yet I'm finding I have more agreement, solidarity with people on the far left. I mean, the true Marxists, because they at least are saying this is about class and it's about real universal solidarity. We're all together in this. There shouldn't be this whole focus on identitarianism, on tribal politics. This is a means of, as I was saying earlier, distraction, a way of divide and conquer.
Yeah.
And
not that it's not a real problem, not that there aren't real problems underlying. It's just that they've been hijacked and exploited. That's my view. I mean,
for me, the perfect symbolic, and I know it's just a symbol, but it kind of speaks to it, is this insistence that we refer to Hispanics as Latinx. And this is met with complete derision by actual Hispanics. They don't want to be called Latinx, and they're being told to by rich white people. It's just that there are so many absurd, mad, wild, unbelievable elements to this entire vision. And to me, it seems like such obvious puffery, like an ideological souffle, and yet it's dominant right now. And to me, is the best indication that it is what it says it is, under right below the surface, which is it's a way to solidify elite power and control, and to protect for the indefinite future its status and wealth.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to. I do know people of Hispanic background who agree with those positions, but so we can't. It's hard to speak for an
Right.
entire demographic, and I mean, why should we? We're all people. I just don't like being put in that box or that tribe but anyway, I have a couple questions that I want to dig into before we move over to the bonus question. The list of generations that you talk about, the founder generation, the builder generation, the renewers, the managers, and the lifestyle, the born to rule lifestyle generation, which can then repeat itself, I guess. So are we in the manager generation at this point? Where do you think we are? Or are we in I guess maybe even in a transition?
Well, I think we're deep in the lifestyle.
You are,
generation.
Okay.
And one of the key indicators that we are is that the lifestyle people aren't the people who are in leadership positions. The people in leadership positions like Nancy Pelosi or Mr. Biden, Bernie Sanders, they're from several generations back.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
There hasn't been a successful handoff, in large part because my observation is that they're not serious people.
What is that about? Why is it so hard, particularly in the Democratic Party, but not just? You have to wait, like, I don't know, 50 years to get, if you're climbing the ladder, you're stuck on a lower rung for decades. Why won't they retire?
Part of it is that there is, and then this is just a sensation on my part, part of it is sclerosis, this sort of hardening of the arteries in a party that has been tending in that direction for a long time. But a large part of it, too, is the fact that the younger age cohorts aren't competitive in actual presentation. And you saw that in all the debates. They're not there. And
I would disagree, though. I'd say Tulsi Gabbard was good.
She was. Look what happened to her. I'm a big supporter of hers. I really like her. I'd probably
that's where this affinity that you're finding with people who are politically different from you. I was very disappointed in what she did with endorsing Joe Biden, but overall, yeah, she would have been my top choice.
Well, she was outed. I mean, she was put in Coventry. She wasn't purged, but it was as close to purging
practically.
And the same is true with Yang. He was just ignored until they couldn't ignore him anymore. Now they still put him down. I mean, the whole Asian thing is another enormous contradiction because, the party that's accusing discrimination of Asians as being white supremacist is absurd because Asians are the most discriminated against group in America when it comes to Ivy League admissions. And it is there are lawsuits galore about that now. Also, the woke constantly refer to Asians as white adjacent, which is appalling. And then if you look at all the actual attacks on Asians, a hugely disproportionate number is by African-American youths, men. And it's an incredible situation to have this stark an example of doublethink in the political discourse. And so my sense is that all of the really capable people who could otherwise emerge to leadership in either party, but especially in a geriatric party like the democracy, is that's what they used to call themselves before the Civil War. I mean, that it's an indicator of how corrupt the system has become. It's not just sclerotic, but it's holding on to leadership like the Supreme Soviet did. All of the last leaders of the Soviet Union, Brezhnev, Chernenko, Andropov, they were all half dead when they toward the end for Brezhnev, but Chernenko and Andropov were barely alive when they took power, as it were. It was a system that could not continue much longer. And if you look at the entire primary season in 2020, and you look at all the debates, there's a lot of not ready for prime time going on there. And not that the Republicans were any better, but the dominance in 2016 of Mr. Trump was the fact that he called it out. He called out the absurdity of a system that had ceased to function. And, you know, here was Jeb Bush, for example, up front getting $100 million. And his campaign manager was certain that he would be the nominee because he had so much money. And he said so in several magazine article or interviews I read with the manager. And it was so corrupt. And here was Trump saying, this is all a sham and a charade. And no wonder he was able to triumph. And the biggest problem here, and I want to inject this into the mix, is that when the elite fails, the most dangerous thing that happened, and it happened in Rome, and it's happening now, is that the left behind, you know, the deeply dissatisfied, angry majority look to what I called the leader cult. They look to a person. It doesn't have to be a man by any means, but if you look at history, it's full of those who've been able to be a kind of a deliverer, and to, you know, I will deliver you out of this vale of tears, this wilderness. And this is a real danger, because that tends to mean that your choice is between a sclerotic ruling class whose younger generation is spoiled and unable to look at the world seriously or responsibly, and then in contrast, these meteoric, charismatic leaders who speak to the people. When you speak to the people, like Mr. Trump did, and the way someone in the past, like Napoleon or Hitler, they would establish an emotional bond. People would feel that they were directly connected. And that was the amazing thing about FDR. What makes him kind of unusual in a unique way is that he did the same thing, but he did it by doing it through radio, through fireside chats. He established that connection, but he did so in a way that was, I think, informed by his own aristocratic pedigree, so that he had an amazing capacity to balance all of these things, and was very aware of the elite people gap. And that's where his disability became such a strength for him. And when he founded Warm Springs, you know, this camp for polio victims, and would be there with them in the pool, it was a very powerful image. And that is, I think, at the heart of the populist
well, don't forget Eleanor too, if the stories are true. My son bought me a book on Eleanor, so if I am to, you know, trust that, I think she was the one who was out on the ground, and also his vice president. So he had people around him, and he had pressure. He had political pressure that exists today too. But we'll see how it's handle.
Well, he had an impossible juggling job because the Democratic Party at that point was so set against itself, because he had to appeal to ardent Southern segregationists. He also had to reach out to African Americans, and he did it, and he did it in large part because it was a supportive context for him. If he could take advantage of it, which he did. But that today, I would expect the best outcome we'd get would be another FDR. The worst outcome would be certain other charismatic figures from history that we all know and love.
Interesting. If we could switch over to, well, I just want to read your last paragraph too, because this is what I keep seeing this happening. And so, and it puzzles me. Failure, people who failed, sometimes it's spectacular or absurdist ways, but then they're back and they're doing the same thing, and they're doing it even more than they did before. And I'm just like, it just, to me, I don't know, me and some friends around me, there's a state of consciousness now, which is, I am not surprised and yet I'm shocked. It's a paradoxical, and I think a lot of people are I guess it comes from living in an era like this. But in your last paragraph, you say, I think this is the last paragraph, you say, finally a divide and conquer strategy really works. Double agree with that. And then you say, this is not only a crushingly cruel way to hold power, the 24/7 lies that can only amplify commitment to insurgency, unwilling to change course and unable to prevent the coming fall. Doubling down is the only elite option, which is very scary, which makes, in past years, there have been a lot of things where, I can remember back in the 2014 time period, people saying, it looks like they're trying to rile up another world war here, or, moving to Russia's borders and doing that Ukraine thing. But even Brzezinski would say, well, we're not going to war with we're never going to a war with the Russians. But ever since then, I don't know, do you believe that now? From what you see, it just seems like this doubling down, this desperation puts options back on the table that everyone would have agreed across the board that, we're never going to go there. Or it makes us uncertain about it anyway.
That's right. Part of the tremendous weakness among the lifestyle elite when you get to the final stage is that they exhibit risk-taking that would never be considered by a more, mature or seasoned and committed leadership generation. And I see this a lot in Russia policy, especially. I was watching I was part of a Zoom conference yesterday talking about what Putin's up to and what we can expect. And of course, the underlying question was, will this result in a war? And I was listening to some of the, young analysts, and they were talking in ways that really disturbed me. They didn't have an awareness, it seemed, of what Russia was really about and how Russia was. And here, of course, I mean the Russian leadership class, how they had filtered and sorted out their own historical experience and what that meant to them, and how their own fathers and grandfathers had behaved. They didn't seem to be aware of any of that. They were talking from a standard American-centric, self-absorbed foreign policy speak in Washington, things that they had learned recently in graduate school, or just taking in the the cant and the patois of their own circles, and talking like, well, we have to stand up, and if we don't stand up, we will put our position in the world at risk. And it was all a kind of a vanity. In other words, they were looking at foreign policy and big decisions through the lens of their own narcissism. Here they were now in the seat of power, as it were, and their approach was just reflexive, and it was based on the kind of sense of having inherited American greatness, and now they were at the center of American empire, and they were going to take the helm, and not realizing that the kind of actions they're proposing are almost certain to lead to conflict with Russia. Conflict that, if properly configured by Mr. Putin, will lead to a Russian victory. And in fact, by standing up, as they say, to Putin, they will lead the U.S. into a kind of a debacle. They'll achieve the very thing they say needs to be avoided. And I feel this is also the case, but in a much bigger and more serious way with China. So in effect, the course of the elite in our own experience, and is taking the country to a place where structurally the latest generation of the elite is inclining toward very, very poor, very risky decisions. And this is not unlike the French elite in the period of Louis XVI, where the decisions that were made completely undercut the authority of the king, put France into a deep financial crisis, and ultimately, triggered the revolution. And I feel that any kind of confrontation in the world in the next several years could do just the same thing, because I think a divided society, or a society actually set against itself, is not in a position to fight a war or to engage in a military confrontation successfully. And this has been the case many times. It was certainly the case for Russia in 1905, but most especially in 1917. And a grand showcase failure in front of the whole world is one of those kinds of events that can collapse the authority and the legitimacy of an entire ruling class and its regime. And so this is quite something to watch.
It would be normal for a ruling elite to cultivate the next generation, would it not, to who succeed them? In the case of Russia, I also see a lot of policy, strategy, and analysis that just seems to be parroting a narrative that was developed. It seems to me, I'm not an expert, but I have read a lot about the generation in the 90s that intended, the end of the Cold War, that intended to dominate, slice up Russia, whatever their grand plan was, which succeeded and then failed, or was reversed, or was pushed back. Things don't just go on a straight trajectory, right? That's not the way history works. There's back and forth. To me, it seems like the bigger problem, that I don't know which is the bigger problem, but there's another problem of a generation that failed in a project that they worked on, and they're relentless. They never give up. They just double down. So it's almost like a double whammy. The problem is a double whammy, the newer generation coming on, and the one that is holding on because, I don't know, maybe they want to go out in glory, or they don't want to go out as a failure.
they don't see themselves going out. And in fact, I think Stephen Cohen was most eloquent about this in the
Yeah.
conversation, especially I had with him. He really had a deeper understanding of not only what was going on in Russia, but of the kind of narcissism that has overwhelmed our elites. And what happened in the 90s was breathtaking. You had people like, well, first of all, you had Clinton himself, but then you had people who'd sworn to remake Russia in our image. And then you had agreements that were made that NATO would never encroach on Russia beyond a certain line.
Right.
And we kept on doing it. And under Mr. Clinton's wife's term as Secretary of State, that was extended to trying to bring in Ukraine into NATO. And the Bush administration, another elitist neocon member of of the circle of the elite, tried to do the same thing with Georgia. And essentially, it's you could call it a red line, but it's more than a red line. It's inflicting a deep collective humiliation on Russia. And, they did a pretty good job. Gorbachev was a pretty good guy, still is. But they managed to dismantle the Soviet Union without a war. That's an achievement.
And a transformation, there is, not total. There's still some nostalgia for it, but.
Well, there's nostalgia for the greatness, not for life in the Soviet Union, which was pretty miserable. I spent some time there and it was shocking to me. And yet, it's their shocking world, and they have every right to be proud of the things that are worth being proud of. Yeah. And we were stripping them of the pride in their own identity and what it means to be great. And Russia is great. It's a great civilization. And to set about almost deliberately to bring it down, because that was Ms. Clinton's goal, was to overthrow Putin and not just bring Ukraine into NATO, but also to pull Russia into a kind of submission to the U.S. So you can call that democracy. I don't care what you call it. People should be able to go their own way in the world. And there is a presumption, a righteous presumption that has always been a problem in American exceptionalism that really came out after World War II, but most intensely it's come out with the Soviet Union, and that is that we have the right to essentially dictate what kind of world others live in. And this is backfiring spectacularly now. And yet, the key thing about the elites is that they're born to rule something that they feel they own. And so they've imbibed the most narcissistic aspect of American exceptionalism and made it the heart of their worldview. So I find that frightening. I was at another Zoom foreign policy meeting on human rights. And at the end of that, the people, the experts who were talking about human rights finally addressed human rights. And they did so as like, oh, of course, we have to consider human rights, not just realpolitik. And they were talking about human rights as though it were some ornament and some a badge that gave America authority. Not that we were actually motivated about human rights, but that the human rights themselves were a kind of imprimatur of authority. And
yes, it's really something to watch.
I know. Well, but what's happening in foreign policy is deeply connected to what's happening here.
Very much.
This is so scary because we're beginning to look like France 1940 or France in 1870. We're in no position to go into a foreign crisis and get out of it with the country intact.
Yeah, I noted that. First of all, I'm scared too by the things that are particularly. I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but if you've been close watching the situation with Ukraine, and you know the history of how this evolved in the 90s and what the overall goals were, and this doubling down that we keep seeing. You know, every once in a while there's a relief. You're like, okay, thank God they're going to just, they're going to come to their senses on that, and they don't. It just keeps re-emerging and re-emerging in a seemingly crazier way each time, and for ridiculous reasons. Right now, I read an article about some new sanctions on Russia. It seemed like things were cooling down, and now today, Biden's not going to meet with Putin, and we're kicking out some more diplomats and more sanctions, and the justifications are Russian election meddling. I mean, that's so lazy.
It's lazy. So mythology in many cases. I mean, there's far more election meddling by China, for example, and
internally.
Internally. But the key here is that Russia can ceremonially orchestrate, by what they're doing, a situation where the U.S. overreacts and sends certain kinds of assistance to Ukraine, which then Russia can publicly use as a casus belli and say this, Ukraine is getting ready to attack the breakaway provinces, and then it can go in. And at that point, if they configure the crisis in such a way, they can pull off, I think, a kind of debilitating coup de théâtre. In other words, they'll orchestrate a kind of crisis military theater where Ukraine comes out basically prostrate and agrees to all of Russia's terms, in which case we will have been, Russia doesn't really want territory here.
No.
It wants to bring Ukraine into a position where it's not going to move toward the West.
And it's more stable, yeah.
More stable, which it's not right now. And the result is going to be a kind of unexpected humiliation of the U.S. And I think that that can't be conceived of by the people who are running our foreign policy today.
I don't know. All these unexpected and unintended consequences happen again and again. It makes you wonder. I want to go with your theory of it's just this collapse. And it's, there are parallels in history. But anyway, I've kept you so long. Do you have time to talk about that bonus question about your Civil War? Okay. Just a few minutes. So the bonus question is more toward your Civil War work, although I can see how they're always interwoven. I just would like to hear your thoughts on this new Civil War, the cancel culture that you say is a response to decline, and some of the warnings from the Ides of March article that you wrote. The answer to the bonus question is in the extra bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to all bonus content by subscribing at Rockfin or Patreon, plus other perks like patron live streams, Zoom calls, and access to our Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves. So that's my pitch, and I hope that some of you will join us. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up. Yeah, that's a lot to chew on. I'm going to think about that for quite a while. And I very much appreciate you coming on the podcast to talk with us. I also appreciate your willingness to find common ground with people who are politically very different from you. And that's something that I think is going to be more, I think it's always important, but I think, right, it's probably more important than ever. It's certainly in my lifetime. I'm somebody who you would probably refer to as the far left. We go like, really? You know, I don't consider myself as the far left. In fact, I'm an independent now. And that's another wild card that people are constantly red and blue because we kind of have to. But there's a very big, murky middle now, although the statisticians claim that you could still categorize most of them as red or blue, even if they are not no longer affiliated or never were affiliated with a political party. But that, like what I see in the woke world on social media, let's say, which is our lens to almost everything, is not what I experience in real life. I don't know if that's because I live in suburbia or I live in a very blue state outside of maybe the bluest city in the country. But this kind of discord is not something that I see in my life. I've always had, people of other parties living next door or across the street or whatever. And in the stores, the racial tension and the gender tension that is, surely there, but I don't experience it that much in real life.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're actually, from everything you've said, you would be center right, and so you might vote Social Democrat, not or Christian Democrat, but Social Democrat probably, and that's pretty much center right.
In Europe, you mean?
Europe, but we don't have the same distinctions. But to me, far left is Bolshevik. Then slightly less farther left are Mensheviks, and then less left are social revolutionaries, and then they're socialists, and they're a huge. They've always been a specific set of gradations, and it is so funny how Americans, have basically emptied an important lexicon. They've emptied it of content. So left could be somebody who, I mean, it's too funny for words. It's not even possible to assign left and right anymore. And where the terms come from, the French Revolution, because the shape of the assembly was such that you were a Jacobin, you were on the left, and if you were a Girondist, you were on the right seating. And the joke, of course, is if you have a completely circular seating arrangement in the assembly, then you would go so far left and so far right. And that's a good metaphor, because I find myself in not in practical, but in ideational sympathy with people who are, essentially Marxist, at least in terms of their honesty and their ability to analyze the nature of society and what's going on now. And that's pretty funny.
Yeah. I find myself astounded. Like, I would have been in the progressive category for a period of time. I don't like where the progressive, I don't even know who the progressive leaders are, but I don't like where a lot of the progressive movement is going at the moment. Yes. And I'm peeled away from it. I don't like to be put in boxes anyway, but some of the things that I agree with, or people who I find myself agreeing with, even just for the moment on the right, it's still kind of shocking, right. But at the same time, important, because even if we fiercely disagree with each other on things, we have to keep talking. We got to find that common ground. I find it mostly in the war and foreign policy, because, as you said, right, it is more and more tied to our domestic. Maybe it always was, and it was just masked. I don't know. But for that reason, and for all kinds of reasons, I appreciate you coming on the podcast, and I enjoyed our conversation. And if you would, please tell everyone how to follow your work. how to read your work, how to support your work?
Oh, well, I mean, it's just a website, anewcivilwar.com. That's mostly where I appear. I have several articles on the American Conservative as well. That's theamericanconservative.com. But if you'd put those links down at the bottom of whatever page you have for the podcast, I'd appreciate that too.
Will do. Okay, it was great to meet you. Thanks so much.
Same here, John. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening. Special thanks to Michael Vlahos. Follow him on Twitter at Michalis Vlahos. That's MICHALIS_VLAHOS. And find his work at his blog, anewcivilwar.com. This podcast is independent media. Listener support really important. Rockfin.com/Around the Empire, Patreon.com/Around the Empire, PayPal.me/Around the Empire Pod. You can find it on any mobile podcast app, on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Rockfin, Patreon, or on YouTube. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take good care, everybody.